Hey, everybody. Welcome to Represent Jesus Well, an RCC podcast. We're all about uncovering ways that people endure, live, and lead that, like the title says, Represent Jesus Well. I am really grateful and excited that I get to spend the next little bit here talking to Nick Connolly, pastor at Bright City Church in North Carolina. So it's miles away from us, and it's super exciting. Charlotte, North Carolina.
So I'm going to switch it up on you a little bit. It's one of the Carolinas, but it's Charleston, South Carolina. So
Charleston, South. How did I get that wrong?
You're great.
I get this all the time. It's great.
So it's my experience that people who aren't from the South, they say the Carolinas, which is like that's insurance. It's like, oh yeah, the Carolinas.
Yeah, it's one of the Carolinas.
We vacation in the Carolinas, and and it's like, yeah, okay. So you went to Myrtle Beach at some point in your life. I got it. Understand.
Oh man,
but no,
which I haven't, but good deal.
you are Myrtle Beach is the Las Vegas of the South, so you are not missing anything. No diss to Vegas or anything like that, but it just reminds me so much of Vegas.
That's awesome. Well, so sorry for getting that wrong, but you are the Bright City Church, and you've started that recently. I know you because, honestly, years ago, my wife, Meg, was part of something called the Influence Network, and your wife, Jess Connolly, started that with a number of other people, did a whole bunch of crazy stuff. And so I got connected with you like years ago, and so now it's fun, literally like 10 years later, or maybe 8 years, something like that.
It's a long time.
Circle back a bit and chat and reconnect. Tell us a little bit about you, about the church, and about what you're excited and passionate about.
Great start. So I'm actually, you weren't far because I am from Charlotte, North Carolina. I grew up there.
Okay.
And then I bounced. We literally moved, I think it was 10 times in the first 9 years of our marriage. But we moved a lot, and part of that was just helping out various churches over the years, and churches helping out us. And so we've moved around. We've got 4 kids. We are in the teenage witching hour. Actually I have a 16-year-old as of this week, and then I'll have a 15-year-old and then a 14-year-old. They stair step. And then I also have a 10-year-old as of this week. And so we have a church and we have a youth group living in our home, which makes for fun times.
Exciting.
Yeah. But the church is actually here in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's been going for about 9 years. And I know that you had Sharon of Sharon and Ike Miller on here, Pastor Sharon and Ike, and they're dear friends of ours who have Bright City in Raleigh. And so we love to stay connected to them. And I think it's about 5 hours from us to where they are, but representing the Carolinas well.
That's beautiful. That's awesome. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is first, just because I've been able to watch from afar as you've led your church. Just one of those things online, you get connected and you kind of watch somebody do things well. And it's been really fun to watch your commentary on the way that you've led church and experienced church. And but then additionally, recently we stumbled on this topic of which you gave a sermon series on recently called Persistent Resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And the thought of that resonates deeply because if you've lived any life, you've faced resistance. And some of us live that life in such a way where if you experience resistance, you stop and you turn around.
Yeah.
But you have this really interesting take on this where that's not always the right thing to do. And especially when you take into consideration how God leads through resistance. I would love to just spend the next bit digging into that topic with you.
Let's do it.
So tell me first, how is that something that's important to you? What made that come out of you?
Yeah. So I think I just literally last week hit 40 years old. And so part of that is that I have a few years under my belt. And then the other half of that is I have no idea what I'm talking about because I have the rest of my life to live. But one of the things that I've seen in my life is a pattern of resistance. And what I just in that sermon series called it persistent resistance, because I think we all feel that, right? Like when it rains, it pours. Like when things happen, they happen in batches. And so a lot of times we rightfully so become discouraged about those types of seasons in our lives. And so having this huge sample size of my life, and knowing the things that Jess and I had been through, knowing the things that we were currently battling within ministry in our church, and we even have businesses on the side, just things that happen in the midst of those things, it just became clear that resistance was this weird pattern in our lives. And so then you kind of step back and you're like, okay, what's going on? Why is this happening? And, early in my 20s, like if I experienced resistance working a job, I was like, well, that's their fault. I'm just going to switch my job. Like I'll get a better job. Like the grass is always greener over here. And then if there was any type of resistance within a community context, it's like, well, okay, there's plenty of fish in the sea. I'll just get new friends or new community, or, I think for some of your listeners, it could be a new church. You're like, these guys are crazy. I'm going to find people who are actually normal. And then what I found is that no matter where I pivoted or the places that I landed as a result of that, number one, they weren't the problem. I was the problem, and God was trying to do a work in me. And then number two, there would be resistance there. And so kind of the wild idea that I had that came from, actually it was rereading James 1. And I have it's like a prideful, humbling moment. When I was younger, I just had a group of people that would try to memorize James, the book of James. Like we were just in college, there was just these guys that could like memorize the New Testament. And that's just not how my brain worked. And then also we had a prideful moment where we were like, well, of course, like the book we need to do is we need to do James, because like clearly we can live this message out, which we couldn't. But what happened was I found myself getting only to like verse 5 of chapter 1. And so I had that part down really well. And one of the things it didn't get very far. And one of the things that James says in that moment, he says, consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many types, because the testing of your faith is meant to produce this work in us, this maturing work, this persevering work. And so I kind of reread it just in a new way recently. And one of the things that I realized was, number one, if you are facing resistance, it's most likely because you are a child of God. So just rooting that back into John chapter 10, right? So Jesus has come so I have life and have it to the full, but the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So God's coming to give us abundance, but the enemy is going to do everything he can to war against that abundance. So if you find yourself experiencing resistance, it's probably because you're a part of that fold of God. You're like, God is in your mix. And even if someone is not yet a professing believer, like, if you've been in the church world long enough, or the pastoral world long enough, like you start to see people come to faith, not because they had like an amazing revival on a vacation, but because they experienced some deep pain in their life. They experienced resistance.
Yeah. I've definitely heard one of those two stories, not the other one. Not when you're on vacation, only when it's been difficult.
Yeah, when there's resistance.
It's so true.
And so God's either calling us home, or he's confirming us that we're home when it comes to resistance. And so that was very affirming to me. And then the second piece to this James verse that stuck out to me for the first time was that a lot of times I felt like if I was hitting resistance, I was heading in the wrong way. So like, well, clearly this is the wrong way. Like, God, you opened up a door somewhere else, or you closed the door and I climbed through the window. Like, I need to course correct. Like, I need to get back on the straight and narrow. But what I found is that if I was experiencing resistance, I was experiencing it because I was heading in the right direction. So take like your dream job, for example. Like if people in your congregation are working this like dream job, and they're so excited about starting this dream job, and they get there and they find themselves working with Dwight Schrute of The Office, if anybody's an Office fan, or somebody difficult at work that's hard to handle, your immediate thought is that I've got to get another job, right? Like this was the dream, now it's the nightmare. And so what I've found in my own life is that this obviously there's always the 1%, but 99% of the time, if I'm experiencing resistance, it's because I'm heading in the right direction, and God is wanting to do something inside of me, and He's wanting to do something through me, and He's in some ways using that resistance to almost confirm that, which is almost contrary to how we would think.
Yes, I'm really curious about that distinction between the 1% and the 99% and how you draw those lines.
Great question. So we actually talk about this in the book, because when you're reading a book, obviously not everyone, we don't try to read with skepticism, but like I feel like we all have got a little bit of skepticism in our hearts where it's like, oh, that won't work for me. It's like, no, I'm pretty sure it will. It's called oxygen. We all breathe it. Like, you're going to be okay. No, 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 no. That won't work for me. Oxygen doesn't work for me. I actually, we're resistant to everything. But what I've found is that there are 1% situations where you might be actually in a toxic environment or a harmful relationship. And so if you find yourself in the midst of, like, I think marriage is a great example. If someone finds themselves in the midst of some sort of abuse, kind of how we address it in the book is like, well, number one, there needs to be some sort of like pause, and then there might need to be some sort of pivot. And I'm not in
Yeah.
everyone's story, and I'm not in everyone's life. That's between them and God and the community that they root themselves in. But for most of the time, we're experiencing resistance because we're heading in the right direction. And then every once in a while, there is a toxic environment where you're like, man, I actually, in order for me to persevere in the greater calling that God has for me in my life, I've got to pause and I've got to pivot. Like, I've got to get out of this situation, because if I don't, I won't persevere.
So okay, I want to do two things really quick,
Okay.
and then I want to really get into the resistance side of things,
Okay.
and when you can, how you handle it. The first thing is you say pause and pivot.
Yes.
Excuse me, no, back up. Book. You said book.
Yes.
We haven't talked about that yet.
That's
Tell me
okay.
about what that is.
So
yeah, what is this thing?
I'm finishing a book that comes out in, I think it's either February or March of 2024, and it's called
Awesome.
Don't Give Up Just Yet. And so the heart behind it is, especially post-pandemic, I think either we were holding on by a thread, or we're trying to figure out how to do life in this new way, in this new world. And so my goal is not to make everyone hang on, but my goal is to say, hey, before you like tap out, before you let go of the dream, before you let go of the thing that you longed for all these years and you finally have it and it's not working out like you thought it would, before you let go of the marriage, like before you let go of the church plant, like before you do any of those things, like just give me 30,000 words. Which everybody's like, oh my gosh, 30,000 words. No, that's a short compared to a normal book. Just give me a moment of your time. Let's talk through it, and then let's make a plan moving forward. Because what I find is that if it's not this situation that you're currently in, it's going to be in another situation at a later time. Because I think sometimes we, as the people of God and the children of God, we are fixated on the promise rather than the process of what God's doing in our life. And so we're like, oh, I've got my eyes on the promise. I got my eyes on the promise. I did that with our church plant. It was like the promise was the church plant, and I didn't care about the process. And God's like, well, I can hold the promise and the process, and I'm actually concerned with both of them. And I care who you are becoming, probably more so than where you end up. And so I think that's the heart. It's just saying, hey, like let's talk about the process for a second before we let go of the promise.
I love the title. Don't give up just yet. It's like full of hope, even in just that statement. And I love that. It's really, really good. I think if we can use anything right now, it's a little bit of hope in those moments where you're not sure where to go. So that's fantastic. I can't wait for it. And then two, you talk about pause and pivot,
yes,
which I think are great words. The pause part. What if you think you might be in that 1%? What are the questions you ask yourself when you're in that pause moment? Or how do you take a pause?
Yeah, I think there's a lot a lot of ways that people can pause. Like when I think
Yeah.
about things that God's asked me to do in my life, whether that be get married, be a father, or have a certain job, or move to a certain place. Like what's so astounding to me is that it could take a year of like prayer and thought and just processing what he's doing. And then sometimes, depending on what it is, it can take, up to like 5 to 10 years for you actually to receive the promise that God has for you. So take, for example, our church plant. Like I felt God calling us to step out in the planning journey in 2008, but we didn't plant our church until 2014. And
Wow.
with that was just this pause with God of trying to figure out like, okay, what does this mean? How does this work? All that, we were trying to figure out what's going on. And what I find when I talk to people, and I would be the same way, so I'm not throwing shade or, like, how could you? But what I find is that people will spend a ton of time entering into something that God has for them, and they will spend no time getting out of something that's really hard. So like
Yeah.
talk about
Good.
like ministry for a second, just because that, for you and I, that's a little bit our world. The process to get into that is very laborious. But when we look around sometimes, the process to get out of it is very easy. Like there are
Yeah. It's
like you could call up the elders tomorrow and be like, I'm this is a lot. I can't do this, and they would graciously walk you through it. But I just wonder sometimes if we get out of things and quit things too quickly without having the same care that we got into things.
yeah.
So pause.
That is a really good thing. Yeah, because sometimes you just need a little bit of that time. And do you like for you when you've had to pause in the past, does that look like taking time in a very specific way? Does it mean like a week vacation? Does it mean like doing the dramatic moment of like, hey, how do you know that you've paused, I guess? Because
Yeah.
that it's hard for some people. Like, I'm not going to do it just yet. Don't give up just yet. It's
Hmm.
great. But like, how do you set a time? How do you know if it's that? And then I really want to get into the resistance part when it's a good
Yeah.
thing and how you can know it's a good thing.
Yeah. So, the hard part about this is when we walk with Jesus, it's not the relationship that you have with me as Nick Connolly. It's the relationship that the person has with Jesus. And so my encouragement is going to be to talk to God about what he's doing in your life and how he wants you to walk it out. But the thing that I always try to think about, just because I was raised by a single mom, is how is what am I saying going to be just as applicable to a single mom or a mom as it is to like maybe a thought leader or a leader in the world. And so as a mom, like, moms can't say like, oh, this is a hard day, I'm out of here. Like, like this is ridiculous. Like I didn't sign up for poop everywhere. Like this isn't how this worked. I didn't sign up for, like, I knew I wasn't going to sleep for some time. I didn't sign up to sleep ever. And so like those are the questions you want to be sensitive to, is like, how does a single mom pause who's trying to hold up her his or her world? And I think what I know is that pausing looks different for everyone. And to me, when I say pause, I mean, why don't you pause on the decision that you're about to make?
Yeah.
Because there is a ton, like when we read John 1, there is grace upon grace upon grace, and then there's grace that we don't even know about, that we haven't even tapped into yet. So any decision that Nick Connolly makes, like, God can always cover those decisions. But when I read scripture, for better or worse, there are good and hard consequences with every decision that we make. And so if you walk away from the dream, if you walk away from something that you longed for deeply, like, I would love to help you avoid walking through a season of trying to process guilt with God. Like 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 grace covers guilt, but what if we could avoid avoid that step for right now? And so how do we just like pause for a second, just say, hey, I'm not going to make any decisions. That's another thing I've noticed, is that a lot of people make life altering decisions in not great times in their life.
Yep.
Like if you got into ministry, chances are it was like flowers and rainbows. And when you're ready to get out of ministry, it's like missiles and gunfire. Like, you're just feeling it on every end. And so, another great example is like, okay, how can you pause and not make a decision in duress? Like how can you make a healthy decision at a healthy time? Do you need some time away? For a mom, do you need to talk with someone in your life and say, I need some help right now. Like I am drowning. I am struggling. If it's a job, maybe it's talking to your boss and just saying, "Hey, listen, like I I'm working two jobs. I'm getting paid for one. I love it here. I want to be here, but I need some help." And so I think
Yeah.
all of those are amazing options. It's just for whatever reason, we quit becomes the shortest leap for us when it's like, oh, well, quitting that's a big leap. And the one thing I know about the enemy, man, is he is going to do everything he can to cause us to quit, but also let us quit. And so the way out is always like the door with the lights on it flashing that looks incredible.
Yep. The really green
Yeah,
grass, right?
exactly.
So I really am enjoying this
Oh,
conversation because
good.
there's so much in it. I really can't wait for people to hear it.
Could have gone the other
Uh,
way, and everybody's, what in the crap is he saying?
but there's something about it, and for us, that's our church mission is to represent Jesus well. So that looks like being when people look at us, they should see Jesus through us. We're
Mm,
his representatives, his ambassadors. And what I love about this is you're giving people a pathway to know how to represent Jesus well amidst adversity.
hmm.
And when you come across a moment where you need to change, at least if you do change, at least you'll have done it well.
Yeah,
You'll have made this shift. You'll have made the decision with tact, with kindness, with the ability to have had the hard conversations, and that'll be a healthy thing that you can then point to and say, "I can tell you that story, and I'm not ashamed of
yeah.
it."
There's no
Um,
regrets because I took a
exactly.
pause. I got with God. There was the same intentionality of getting out as there was of getting in, and and
Yep.
I believe this is what He's calling us to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So now what I'm really curious about is when you think about the resistance side of things, how can you go about tackling the resistance if you know it's the right thing to tackle?
Yeah,
So you've said, God's called me to this. This is where I'm supposed to be. I'm not called out of this yet. So how do I tackle this well?
yeah,
How do I represent Jesus well in
yeah.
this?
So one of the things that we tried to do in the book and actually did in the sermon series is I tried to highlight certain types of resistance that happened often in my life. So when I look at my life, and I think if we were all honest and we look at our lives, like even though we're different and we all have unique, different stories, and God is doing a unique work in each one of us, the enemy is boring. Like Satan is like he is like the one hit wonder. He's been playing the same song since the beginning of time, and it's not even that good, but it's still kind of catchy, and we don't like it, but we sing it anyway. And what I've found is that there are several types of resistance that happen in my life. And so, kind of one way that we've found in order to fight back is to actually know Satan's playbook and be like, hey, I can expect that. Um, we live in Charleston, South Carolina, and during the fall, I know it's hurricane season, right? And during the fall, I know that we have a window where we are going to either have to like prepare to stay or prepare to leave. I'm not
Yeah.
surprised by these things. And what I found is that it's actually like fun to kind of stick around, assuming it's not catastrophic and be like, oh my gosh, like there's a tropical storm coming, or there's this thing happening in the ocean, and you can look at it and see God's creation. Or if I need to leave, it's like, okay, well, this is what we signed up for. We live in Charleston, South Carolina. It's by the beach. People love the beach, but they don't understand there's a cost to living near the beach. Um, and so what I found is that we can weather storms better when we know what we're expecting, right? Like tornadoes scare the heck out of me. Like people who live in the Midwest in the middle of the country, like you all are the real heroes. Like a storm that could
Those
drop on
sirens,
you at
man.
any moment, at any time. And so with
Totally.
resistance is it's actually probably more like a hurricane, more than you realize. The timing might be a little unexpected, but when you actually step back, we talk about relationships being resistance in our life. Like if we all, took a moment and took a poll right here, I think we would all say that we've dealt with difficult people, but we've also allowed
Yeah.
difficult people to talk us out of doing the thing that God's asked us to do. And so with this book, it's like, well, hey, just a heads up, difficult people could be a type of resistance in your life. So here's what to expect. Don't forget that you too are a difficult person sometimes, and we're all difficult people trying to figure this thing out. But what
Totally.
if you had some handles on how to handle difficult people so that they wouldn't talk you out of doing the very thing that you've been created to do? So
Yeah, man.
there's like six other things
That's
like
so
that.
good. Oh, wow. And that's super helpful because I think uh, there are times where you face something like, is anybody else facing this? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
Like there are other people that have experienced what you're experiencing, and it can be really difficult. So that's a really helpful tool just to know what those things are.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious personally, like for
Hmm.
you, what was maybe one of the times where you faced resistance and you knew that you could get through it, and or you didn't know but you chose and you saw fruit on the other end, like something good come of it?
Yeah. So I think the church is a great example. We had a time. It was probably within the first like 4 years of our existence, and like things are going pretty decent. And I remember we were in a school, and I mean it was grueling. I mean it's just either setting up, you're tearing down, and it's hard. But sometimes when you are experiencing some decent fruit, you can kind of persevere through some of the hard things that come along with things in our lives. And so we had one of the biggest Easters that we've ever had. And so Easter was in April. And then by the middle of that summer, we had lost 60% of those people due to like some really hard and unfortunate circumstances. And so
Oh, that's tough.
kind of where but what was beautiful was this was the birth of this book. I just didn't know it was a book at the time. And what happened is I found myself like in the kitchen, like on a Saturday, like ready to like walk away from being a pastor. And part of it was the difficulties that we were facing with people. And then there was like, this is really, I can't make this up, but there was actually, we had started a Monday night service for, in our current city, we have a lot of people who work food and bev, hospitality, and we have a lot
Wow.
of people who work in the medical community. So a Sunday is not an option for them, and so we were trying to start this Monday option for people who would have that day off. And so we're trying to do this, and then a hurricane's coming, and so we have to cancel. A true story, and it was just disappointment on every level, like just disappointment all around. And for me, I don't know if anybody else is like this, but for me, disappointment always turns into discouragement, and discouragement left unchecked turns into despair. And so I was like, I was out, I was done. I was like, I tap out, and I even said like to Jess, my wife, I was like, listen, I'm not quitting, but I quit. Like just today, this day, I do not work for the church. Like, don't ask me about church stuff. Like, don't ask me about life. Don't ask me about ministry. Anything that she would never ask me about. But I was like, today, which is the pause that I needed. I was like, today, I quit. Um,
I love that. I quit for a
yeah,
day.
and and
It's so
and I
good.
mean, how much better is it to quit for a day than to quit for something that could have been a lifetime of work? Um,
Yeah.
and so after years of just correcting ship and trying to get things back heading in the right direction. Um, Here's the cool part about this message is like, typically in American fashion, the message is like, I was down and out, and then I took my five smooth stones and I slung them and I destroyed that giant, and now I'm king. And I'm sitting here today telling you that I have walked with God every day and tried to be faithful. And then there have been days where I haven't walked with Him very well. And there have been days where I've been obedient, and there have been days where I haven't been obedient to the calling and to the things that God's put in my life. And the fruit is like that fruit that you gotta like squint to see it, but it's there. And so the beautiful thing about this message is we never know when harvest is coming, but harvest is always on the other side of hard times. It just is. Like that's biblically true.
Yeah.
And so for me, like I've just seen some incredible stories happen within our community that you would never see on Instagram, that you would never see tweeted in a tweetable statement. And like the beauty of the community and what's happening at Bright City in Charleston is just it's the payoff. The like being able to sit here and do this podcast with you is the payoff. Like being able to write a book with Tyndale is a beautiful payoff, and of course it comes at a cost, but um, anytime we're able to persevere through the hard things, there is a harvest on the other side, and you know the harvest just looks different for everyone.
Yeah, man, that's really good. That's a fantastic message of hope for people,
Mm-hmm.
because I know there are plenty of people that feel like they're in that moment of, I don't see any light at the end. And when you're telling me to not give up just yet, whew,
Yeah,
it's hard to take. But when you say it like that, there's just so much hope, and that's a really great message. I really appreciate you sharing that.
absolutely.
Um, so I'm excited for you to get this book out and for that to happen. That's a big deal because I think it's going to be great. I can't wait to read it. And as you for your future, like the church, like what is your excitement about for the church over the next few years? Actually, let me give you a specific question.
Yeah.
Um, you've got this book, and like the thought of writing a book is always there, right? Like it's something that's interesting. Do you have a book in you? And from what I've heard from different people, when you have one, the best way to write it for is to write it for some specific person.
Mm.
Like you're like have a person in mind. So maybe it was you, maybe it was for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You just had to get the words on the page. I know how that is, but I'm curious, as you look at your church, are there individuals that you had in mind that you're like, man, I just hope that this message hits? Maybe during the sermon series that resonated.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what
Yeah.
I'm
Oh,
saying?
yeah.
I'm just curious. Is there anything that's like comes to mind when you think about that?
Yeah. And I think I'll say it this way is what I think has been beautiful is seeing like this message lived out in a single mom who's like at Bright City or like someone who's in the
Yeah.
fight of their life. Um, and I can like see them remaining persistent in the midst of resistance. Like I had this one person who's a part of our community come up for prayer after the service, and she had a very specific prayer of wanting to see reconciliation and forgiveness in a very specific relationship. And the relationship was neutral at the time. And so she comes up, we pray, like tears are everywhere, like, you know, God's on the move. And then literally almost like the next day, um, out of nowhere, the person that she prayed about like just blew up in anger and
Hmm.
just came after her. And and from that moment, it's like, well, that's resistance, and I guess I'm heading in the wrong direction. Like I shouldn't, you know, I don't want restoration or anything for that person because they're, you know, now they're being not unkind. And to see this person like rise up and just say, you know what, like that was the prayer, and this is what God wants, and that's the right direction. Now here comes the resistance. Like Nick said this would happen, and and so God said this would happen, and so I'm gonna like keep going, and I'm gonna persevere. And so I think more than I've written it for someone. I think the beautiful thing about Bright City Charleston is that I've seen it in our people, and so it's just beautiful to watch that happen in other people.
That's really incredible. Um, like it makes me feel things, right? Like that's a beautiful
Yeah.
message of somebody actually experiencing that, having that prayer and having that desire. And then if you wouldn't had that message, they might have run away
Mm-hmm.
from that. You know what I mean? And I know countless people that's the story of every week,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you experience resistance, so you shy away from saying what needs to be said. You experience a hardship, and you don't push yourself to get over that next mountain that really God has for
Mm-hmm.
you. And I think it involves so much of seeing the vision of what God wants. You said something earlier. You said there's the promise and then there's the process,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really great to see how those two things can be held in this process. You can't let go of either, because if you're just about the process, you might kind of lose the direction, and if you're just about the promise, you might never get
Yeah.
there. So I really think that's
Amen.
awesome, man. I love this conversation. I'm super excited to hear this book and read this book, and I just excited to see what it does in people, and it's really neat. Maybe one of my favorite things when I've been talking with people and pastors over the years is, especially when you're coming from a book, is when the book comes out of a place and a
Mm.
people, not out of some big dream future. You've experienced this in your own
Yeah.
life, and you've experienced this in everyday life with people who know your name, who give you a hard time, who joke around with you and know your faults, and yet you can still say this message and it resonates. That's a really cool thing,
Yeah. And it's
man.
it yeah, I think the book will do what it does, and I think and it'll find itself into the hands of the people that it finds itself in their hands, and I think it's just cool though that it's like, oh well, I saw God move in this community in this way, and so it's like outside of that it's all just, cake.
That's awesome, man. I can't wait. So, Nick Connolly, thank you so much for being on this podcast. Thank you so much for chatting. I really appreciate you taking the time, man.
Absolutely. And we love you guys and just are super excited for what you guys. I know we've spoken briefly off the podcast and all the things that you
Yeah,
guys
yeah.
have going on up there. And I think the people in the north and middle of the country are the bravest people in the world. What is the current temperature right now?
It's probably like 25. It's nice and warm here.
Holy moly. Y'all are pioneers. Y'all are the bravest people on the planet. It's like 50 something
Well,
today, and I'm like, am I gonna be able to go to the beach today? Like, this is horrible.
well, you endure hurricanes. I mean, there's something to be said for
Try
that.
to, try to.
Oh, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Nick. I so appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You bet.